All right, this is going to be part 5 in the Operational Excellence series for the UPNS Merger YouTube channel. And because the reason I decided to include it there is because it has to do with John Orr, who is Chief Operations Officer at Norfolk Southern since March 20th of 2024. And so he played a role previously at Mac Yard. And so this video is basically the same as part 4 in the Rail Families United YouTube channel, the Mac Yard incident series. So if you look, and again, if you are on the UPNS Merger YouTube channel, you really should be looking at everything that's also posted at Rail Families United YouTube channel, because that provides all the history of, and a lot of information on the players that are now in the U.S. rail industry, and they're definitely key players in the UPNS merger also. So again, I'm going to put this as part 5 in the Operational Excellence series on the UPNS merger channel, and also it is basically part 4 of the Mac Yard incident series on Rail Families United. So just the heads up that those two videos are almost identical. All right, previously we had seen this in part 3 where the Mac Yard incident helper, who was a fake qualified conductor who may have had as little as, for sure less than 50% of the required training, if you look at the numbers that are provided in the previous videos on Mac Yard, but he may have had as little as 37% of the required training if those were the union contract provisions that required 60 trips to be able to work in Mac Yard. But again, I have to look up the union contract. But the big yards for CN Rail often have special provisions in them requiring more training before someone is considered qualified to work in that yard. And I think that's also true for Toronto, which is one of CN's biggest yards. But anyway, what we saw here was that, the helper or the qualified conductor involved in the 2007 Mac Yard derailment was clearly fake qualified. This incident again involved dangerous goods, the chlorine gas. Rail cars that derailed to them were not compromised, but they could have been outside of a major population center. The things that did get compromised, there was thousands of liters of diesel fuel that ended up leaking out of rail cars that also derailed. So just recouping here, the sketch on the left is a sketch that the Mac Yard fake qualified conductor drew when he was asked to draw Mac Yard. Now he was asked to draw Mac Yard. Mac Yard has over 200 tracks, and if it has 200 tracks, you can be sure it probably has hundreds of switches to access those hundreds of tracks. And that doesn't even count any sidings or, going from one track to another as they often do. So there are definitely, most likely, hundreds of switches in Mac Yard. So for this report pertaining to the 2007 Mac Yard incident, to say that there were no maps provided, there was first of all no testing of yard knowledge during training or the qualification process when you do your field tests, and there were no maps included in the training manuals. There were no maps of the yard in the yard manual. Folks, I mean, in my opinion, that's total criminal negligence. How can you have employees working without maps? And if there's no maps, there's likely no maps. If there's no maps of the tracks, there's likely no maps of the switches either. And that doesn't even get into the issue of whether or not switches were being properly labeled, because as we saw in the brainwashing series and the deadly training materials and all of that, in other videos provided at Rail Families United for the YouTube channel, that it appeared even the actual physical switches may not be properly labeled to match work documentation. And so was that the case for Mackyard too? I don't know. I have no way of knowing that. But anyways, just huge issue. The fact is, John Orr, who is now the Chief Operations Officer at Norfolk Southern, I have no way of knowing if he was still there when the Mackyard incident happened in 2007. The conductor, the fake qualified conductor, was part of the class that had started training in, I think it was April 30th, 2007. But if he was provided with no maps, if there were indeed maps that could be provided in manuals, whatever, in 2005, 2006, when John Orr was in charge of Mackyard. In 2005, he was the assistant general manager for Mackyard. In 2006, he was promoted to general manager of Mackyard. Now, if you did have existing maps in the manuals when he was in charge, why would you take those out of the manual? What would be your excuse for taking maps out of the manual? Would they be that outdated that you decided to take them out and not replace them with anything? You know, I have no way of knowing. I just know that when they did the investigation of Mackyard, no maps, no training, no testing, no qualification tests involved knowledge of this most dangerous yard, which moved, obviously, dangerous goods. And so, if you look again on the right here, the graph that is provided there is not for Mackyard. That's a CN diagram for the entrance to Mackyard. The entrance only. And look at how much more detailed that is than the drawing the helper did, the fake qualified conductor did for Mackyard, which has over 200 tracks. And as I suspect, very likely hundreds of switches. But anyway, so that's the issue. Mackyard happened in 2007, but the operational excellence behind Mackyard, I suspect, dates back to the days of John Orr and potentially earlier than that. Which, again, if you're a chief operations officer for CN Rail, how do you justify these issues? How do you justify not providing safety critical materials to your frontline rail workers? Okay, so John Orr was at Mackyard between 2005 and 2006. If you look at the very bottom of this screen print, which I took from comparably.com, which I guess looks at executives and whatever, this is what their screen print was for John Orr. And the very last two lines here, that are the last two arrows at the bottom, show that John Orr was the assistant general manager at Mackyard in 2005. In 2006, he was promoted to general manager of Mackyard. And then it just states that in 2007, he left and went to Edmonton. Now, I added this block here in red. When exactly did John Orr become general manager in Edmonton in 2007? Because, well, the issue would be, was he still at Mackyard when the fake qualified conductor of the Mackyard incident of 2007 was fake qualified? Or was he still there when the actual incident happened in Mackyard? We're not given, I couldn't find anywhere the date when John Orr actually physically moved to Edmonton in 2007. And that would be one of the main issues, obviously. What's the exact date of his move to or from Mackyard? So if it wasn't John Orr who was in charge of Mackyard during the incident of 2007, when that helper was fake qualified, the supposed qualified conductor, who may have had as little as, you know, he definitely had less than 50% of the required training per previous videos that we looked at or that were provided as far as the Mackyard incident. He may have had as little as 37% of the required training. That depends on the union contract, if Mackyard would have required 60 tours prior to being qualified to work in Mackyard. And CN, their union contracts, when it's a really, really large yard, and Mackyard would be one of those large yards, they often have special provisions for qualifying conductors prior to allowing them to work in those larger yards. So I still have to look up that union contract, but I do believe Mackyard did require 60 tours. And if that was the case, then this helping conductor, newly qualified, fake qualified conductor, may have had as little as 37% of the required training. He definitely had less than 50%, based on the numbers we were given in the Mackyard incident report. Now, so the issue becomes, again, was John Orr still in charge of Mackyard when that incident happened, or when this guy was fake qualified? Or was it someone else? If it was someone else, who took over after John Orr? Who took over Mackyard? We know that John Orr became the Chief Operations Officer at Norfolk Southern March 20th of 2024. And so, you know, his background, his skeletons as far as his operational excellence, would, in my opinion, be something that rail investors need to know about, and the Surface Transportation Board in the U.S. needs to know about, prior to making a decision as to whether or not to allow the UPNS merger, especially given the players that are now in these two companies. So prior to working at Norfolk Southern, John Orr worked at CPKC with Keith Creel and Kansas City Southern and CN Rail in various roles. He literally has spent decades in the rail industry. Now, the person who was the Chief Operations Officer, overseeing all operations for both Canada and the U.S. at the time of the Mackyard incident, was Keith Creel, who is now the CEO of CPKC. But at the time, he was the CN Rail Chief Operations Officer when the Mackyard incident of 2007 actually took place. So those are the key players. And, you know, given, in my opinion, the infestation of the U.S. rail industry by guys of this type of operational excellence, I think the U.S. Surface Transportation Board and the U.S. administration has a lot of issues it needs to consider before allowing, you know, any further infestation of the U.S. rail industry or any more mergers in the U.S. rail industry before these issues of operational excellence and these players are actually properly investigated. Because in my opinion, leopards don't change their spots. If people can get away with what they can get away with because there are no ongoing compliance audits for Class 1 rail carriers, they're going to do exactly what they want to do for maximizing shareholder wealth, in my humble opinion. There needs to be not just an investigation here and there, you know, maybe years in between, maybe decades in between audits. Who knows? You know, when rail executives sign off now on their financial statements, they have to say that they are in compliance with all laws under which they operate. And when it comes to operational excellence in the rail industry, I think it's pretty clear that rail investors may have a lot of issues with what they are now uncovering when it comes to the operational excellence of so many key players in the rail industry, past and present, in my humble opinion. Okay, John Orr, again, was at Mackyard in 2005 and 2006, and thus the operational excellence of providing no maps to frontline rail workers in Mackyard would very likely have been happening under John Orr. Now, the rest of the materials covered in this video have to do with a 2005-2006 Transport Canada audit of Mackyard and or CN rail operations in general. Given that this information was included in the Railway Investigation Report R07T0270 pertaining to the Mackyard rail incident of 2007, surely the Transportation Safety Board felt that the 2005-2006 Transport Canada audit had to also apply to MacYard, or else it wouldn't have been included in a railway investigation report pertaining to MacYard specifically. But, you know, whether or not it's general CN operations or MacYard, if they're doing an audit, Transport Canada very likely audited MacYard, because that would have been one of the largest facilities for CN Rail at the time, and I think to this day it's still one of CN Rail's largest rail yards. So clearly Transport Canada was seeing major problems at CN Rail as far as its operations, and the fact that there's not even maps provided for frontline rail workers working in MacYard, as was disclosed in the 2007 MacYard incident report by the Transportation Safety Board, that just screams of a whole lot of problems with operational excellence in that yard. But anyway, just a little bit of the background. But again, if you're watching this on the UPNS Merger channel, you really need to go back to the Rail Families United YouTube channel also and look at all of the videos that are posted there, especially the ones pertaining to MacYard if you're interested in how things were specifically in MacYard. But there were so many operational issues at CN Rail, and that was revealed because of my investigation or dissection of a rail worker death investigation pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney in 2013. Now, he died out west in Saskatchewan, but, you know, training programs, things like deadly training slide number 53. How old is that thing? Does it go back to 2001? There is no date provided on that deadly training slide. So yeah, you have to wonder, was it part of just the 2007 materials for training, or the 2010 materials, or just the stuff given in 2013? Or might it date back as far back as 2001, when the Railway Association of Canada came up with its own conductor training program, basically for rail carriers in Canada? So what is the origin of deadly training slide number 53? I have no way of knowing. Was it used in MacYard for those rail workers? I have no way of knowing. But these are all questions that frontline rail workers, rail investors, you know, rail customers, all rail families need answers to, including rail regulators. Where is the documentation pertaining to the date of that specific document? And how many rail workers were trained using deadly training slide number 53? I'm not saying it dates back to John Orr and his days in MacYard. He may have had nothing to do with it, but it may have been used by John Orr when he was overseeing MacYard. I have no way of knowing. I just know that there are a lot of operational issues, violations of laws, etc., that were certainly going on at CN Rail. I think quite a while back, especially given you can see fake qualifications in MacYard in 2007. But again, I don't know, when did John Orr leave MacYard in 2007? Was it before the fake qualifications or after? Was it before the MacYard incident or after? That happened, I believe, on September 17th of 2007. But John Orr was certainly there providing his operational excellence before the MacYard incident, and so that is why I include this information as it pertains to John Orr in these materials. And not just John Orr, but CN Rail in general, as far as their operational excellence at CN when it comes to the safety of frontline rail workers, etc. All right, on page 18 of the MacYard incident, the Transportation Safety Board report, our 07T0270, we're told the following. On the 5th of January 2006, Transport Canada published Phase 1 of the final report, Targeted Inspection of CN Operations. Transport Canada's Rail Safety Directorate developed a two-phased action plan to assess overall compliance and safety of CN. Targeted inspections were conducted between August 22nd and September 16th, 2005. Before I keep going here, okay, so back in 2005, they knew that they had problems, and so they were doing this audit. But when you say targeted inspections, it's not like these inspectors are arriving unexpected at CN locations to do their inspections. And so that in and of itself is an issue. Because just as we saw with the in the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney, when I requested all of the materials pertaining to the investigation into that death, one of the sheets I was given was a supposed evaluation sheet for conductor trainee Jason Cluney. And it just so happened that on that train that he was on as a conductor trainee was the CEO of CN Rail, Claude Mongeau. This was about a month before Jason died. And it says on that evaluation sheet that the locomotive engineer and the conductor, were basically compliant with 100% of the rules or whatever, as was expected. Well, they clearly had put some of their best people on that train for the locomotive engineer and the conductor for the CEO train. And so, but there were no comments as to how well the conductor trainee did for his evaluation there. So why give comments that, oh, these two performed exactly as expected, 100% great, no comments on the conductor trainee when you're supposed to be training the trainee on that run. But anyway, so the whole thing of, targeted inspections. Well, if they know you're coming, obviously they will likely take out the best of what they have, in my humble opinion. But it says here, the findings confirmed previous concerns. Well, there's definitely lots of concerns when it comes to the rail industry. In the area of train operations, one of the 5 key areas was identified as the necessity for rules for transfer movements and remote control locomotive operations. Okay, so that was back in 2005-2006 time frame. Well, the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation were put out in, I believe, 1987, and they were never updated to this day. 38 years later, they are now just going to update the regulation pertaining to frontline rail worker training programs. And I suspect that's only because of the pressure they're getting because of the massive investigation I did pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney and, sharing that with massive U.S. rail unions and the U.S. administration also. Because J.D. Vance got a copy of my materials, and so did Jim Jordan. I gave him copies to give to the Trump administration. And so I think there's a reason Chrystia Freeland is now Minister of Transportation. But anyways, here's what I wanted to show you here. So this was back in the time frame of 2005-2006. They had identified issue with the need for rules for remote control locomotive operations. Those rules had never been written. And what's worse is that Transport Canada's first guidelines for remote control locomotive operations only came out in 2019 when I was busy documenting all these issues. That was after the death of a CN employee that had died in remote control locomotive operations. And so that would have been 13 years after Transport Canada first knew of problems with remote control operations not having proper rules written. All of a sudden, now we're going to write guidelines 13 years later? You're kind of slow to the ballpark here and to the game, Transport Canada. And when people's lives are on the line, 13 years is 13 years too long. So then this was a two-phase thing that they had done back in 2006. It says on June 12th of 2006, Transport Canada published Phase 2 of the final report, Audit of Safety Management Practices at CN. The audit conducted between the 14th of November and December 10th of 2005 focused on selected areas of risk identified in Phase 1. Okay, let's see. So that was about a 3-week audit or so, maybe 4 weeks. Not very long, in my opinion. Hardly enough, I would think, to pull all the necessary data. But anyway, findings included the following. There's a disconnect between senior management and frontline supervisors/employees in understanding management's commitment to safety. I'm sorry, what commitment to safety? Are we really seeing commitment to safety here when you see so many violations of so many laws and of the Railway Safety Act, Section 20, with changes to training programs just implemented in the field and apparently not properly approved by Transport Canada prior to field implementation as the law would require? Is that, commitment to safety by CN? And then it says here, many employees and some frontline supervisors feel pressured to get the job done in a manner that could compromise railway safety. Again, there's that pressure to get the job done, even when you got to cut corners, like maybe fake qualifying frontline rail workers and pushing for, 6 trains to be done when that's clearly impossible to do. Just saying, folks. Then it said, there is a need for a comprehensive review of safety for performance by senior management that focuses on more than U.S. Federal Railroad Administration reportable accident criteria. Okay, now that's a really weird one to have in a Canadian railway investigation report. Why is Transport Canada and rail carriers operating in Canada, specifically CN, because, Transport Canada would not be auditing CN's operations in the U.S. They only would be auditing CN's operations in Canada. So why would they be talking about U.S. Federal Railroad Administration reportable accident criteria? That, in my opinion, folks, is just more proof that Transport Canada basically does nothing when it comes to its oversight role if Transport Canada has to rely on U.S. criteria. Where's your Canadian criteria? Why is CN depending on the U.S. criteria for Canadian rail operations? Where's the Canadian criteria for Transport Canada for them to be relying on? Then, data from day-to-day operational monitoring systems could be used more frequently to trigger formal risk assessments. Now, if you don't even want to document the issues properly, in things like, well, it's a delay of assignment. It's not an employee refusal to perform this work due to unsafe conditions or perceived unsafe conditions. So, kind of have to wonder about that day-to-day risk assessment when those types of issues are going on behind the scenes, and when employees that may cause a problem because they refuse to engage in this work, and so we're going to lay them off. and we're going to wait the 28 days. If the issue is not addressed in front of management and with the union rep within 28 days, the issue just evaporates. It's as if it was never there. So there's all these tricks back, in the background that are used. And so how good is the monitoring and the documentation of risk assessments at CN Rail when that type of stuff was going on? And then it says the audit team did not find evidence that data from performance monitoring and rules compliance, PMRCing systems, safety audits, blitzes, and functional safety inspection / defect logs and reports to being used to trigger documented risk assessments. Well, again, when I requested the information tied to the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney, he was on the 58th of 60 supposed requests of 60 trips. He actually only needed 45 trips to be qualified, but he was already on number 58. And about 25% of his evaluations were missing. I wonder if those might have been his observation trips. But anyway, so when I requested all the information tied to conductor trainee Jason Cluney, and to be a qualified conductor, you need to be proficient in about 65 different skills that they evaluate. Well, I only got 4 PMRC sheets for conductor trainee Jason Cluney. PMRC stands for Performance Monitoring for Regulatory Compliance. Here they talk about rules compliance, I guess. But anyways, that's when they're supposed to be evaluated by somebody who's physically evaluating whether or not they're complying with procedures, rules, laws, whatever. And I only had 4 sheets for conductor trainee Jason Cluney. Yet he was on his 58th trip. And those 4 sheets certainly did not evaluate the 65 areas he was supposed to be proficient in to be a qualified conductor, or that he should have been evaluated in. There might have been a dozen things evaluated. I don't think there was much more than that on those 4 sheets. So if CN doesn't even have these evaluation sheets looking at procedure or performance monitoring for regulatory compliance, how could you possibly determine areas of weakness in your programs, your training programs, or maybe with your employees to ensure that they get the proper training that they need if they need additional training in certain areas? And then it says more thorough recording of and tracking of details is necessary to improve the management of risk mitigation strategies, corrective actions. The audit team could not find documented details describing the risk mitigation controls, such as responsibilities, key implementation activities and dates, and status, contrary to the intent of the CN's corrective action / safety measures management standard. So it has been my observation when it comes to Transport Canada and the Transportation Safety Board, and it would look like the same would be true at CN given this paragraph, that there's a lot of nice on paper, but no follow-up, no compliance audits that are ongoing to make sure this stuff is absolutely happening behind the scenes. And there is a huge issue with that when you're dealing with the lives of frontline rail workers and members of the public, may I add, because rail operations and derailments absolutely impact members of the public. All right, as we move on to page 19 of the Backyard Incident Report, we're told the effectiveness of CN's safety culture improvement initiatives needs to be reviewed. The focus on training, involvement, communications, coaching, and recognition were not being effectively implemented. Surprise, surprise, right? Current field level practices were identified as contributing to the high rate of defects / deficiencies in safety and stuff. Okay, well, let me state the obvious. They're stating the obvious here. Current field level practices. You know, I'm not really too concerned about safety practices for somebody working in the office and these rail executives working in their big offices. They're pretty safe where they are in their Eiffel Towers. But field level practices, obviously, that's where the shortcomings are going to be. And that's not just because of field personnel. Those are definitely due to poor management practices and decisions. As we have seen with, somebody had to make the decision to fake qualify or maximize shareholder wealth. That's kind of a chief financial officer thing. And how would you not have, for example, a VP of, let's say, human resources, not questioning the constant churn of the workforce? And, HR, they're supposed to be involved in training and whatever. If you're seeing your workforce constantly churning, wouldn't you have concerns with that? Wouldn't you be saying, wait, maybe we should be looking at our training practices? Maybe we're doing something wrong in training? So the fact that the problem is at field level, well, yeah, that's because that's where the accidents happen, is in the field. You're not having derailments in an executive office. So state the obvious here, but let's not do the extra and explain that the issue is really with management. Then we have CN safety management documentation can be improved. Well, there is supposed to be safety management systems documentation in place at places like CN Rail, and that is per an act which necessitated that documentation exist, and that act dates back to 2001. But when the safety documentation systems documentation was requested after the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney by the Transport Canada Health and Safety Officer, even after 10 months when the report came out pertaining to that death, and this is not the Transportation Safety Board report. This would be the Transport Canada Health and Safety Officer report, which was 80 pages long. Well, as of the release of that report, the safety management systems documentation had still not been released to Transport Canada by CN Rail, even though it had been requested. And, my comeback to Transport Canada on that would have been, why did you not get a court order to force the release of the documentation? Well, maybe that's because even as late as 2018, 19, and I would suspect maybe even to this day, my suspicion, even though that documentation by law was required since 2001, even in 2018, long after the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney, a review of safety management systems practices, well, Transport Canada said that was getting those documents at rail carriers to have them in place was still proving to be a challenge. And I cover that in other videos. And so the fact, I seriously doubt that that documentation, even if it exists, is anywhere near what it is supposed to be. Then let's see, it says on October 11th, 2005, CN provided responses to phase 1 of Transport Canada's targeted inspection activities. CN cooperated with all aspects of the audit and, in general, acted promptly in addressing identified safety concerns and providing corrective action. Rail partners in crime, Transport Canada, the Transportation Safety Board, and rail carriers, given what's been uncovered because of the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney and that whole dissection of a rail worker death investigation that I did, Yeah, you always get sentences like this. Oh, they cooperated fully and, they acted promptly in addressing this. They put out those safety actions taken and what they were going to do. They had the best of intentions to fix the problems. Really? Um, are you still making changes to frontline rail worker training programs without going through proper procedures per the Railway Safety Act, Section 20? Um, you know, if they were acting and, providing corrective actions for identified problems, why did they still not have rules for remote control locomotive operations? Transport Canada had to put out guidelines in 2019, and my analysis of those guidelines, I really ripped them apart. Those guidelines were not too good. That's going to be a whole other video when I do belt pack training and stuff, looking into those issues, and there's a lot of them. And one of the documents I'm actually going to be looking at is a belt pack incident in 2016, which would have been long after this. And, you've also got conductors getting killed long after this. So the commitment to safety when it comes to CN Rail and remote control locomotive operations, I just don't think they're quite there yet. And the same would be true for Transport Canada. Then it says, with regard to remote control locomotive operations, in anticipation of a Section 19 order from Transport Canada, CN committed to bringing forward the order to the Railway Association of Canada Rule Revision Team and filing its submissions by the due date stipulated in Section 19. So after this incident at Mac Yard, the Minister of Transportation, I think his name was Lawrence Cannon at the time, issued a Railway Safety Act Section 19 order. And in that, he basically said to rail carriers operating in Canada, not just CN, all of them, you need to overhaul frontline rail worker training programs because they could clearly see from the Mac Yard incident fake qualifications dating back to at least 2007 when they had the Mac Yard incident, but potentially much earlier too. Let's see, after that we have in June of 2006, Transport Canada's report on Phase 2 of their CN operations audit was published. And here again, in 8 of 11 areas, 8 of 11 areas of the Phase 1 audit selected for verification, corrective action has been implemented. Not when you're still having problems. Go ahead and pretend that you're doing corrective action, but the second that somebody's not looking, we're right back to our old ways again and potentially worse, right? Because fake qualification was definitely still happening for my child. And there's a lot of issues, in my opinion, still happening to this day. So this 8 of 11 areas may look good on paper, more looks good on paper, more bogus safety actions taken, according to the Transportation Safety Board. And, again, let's not forget who's writing this report, the Transportation Safety Board. And I think we can see from the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney and all the lies and deception in that report that can we really trust the Transportation Safety Board? In my opinion, the answer to that question is no. Just way, way, way too many issues still not being addressed, still swept under the carpet with reports that are written in ways, that don't specifically, like in this report, where are you saying that they're violating the Railway Safety Act? Or other things like making changes to railway employee training programs without going through proper channels and that's a violation of the Railway Safety Act, Section 20. They don't specifically state those things in these reports, do they? They don't tell you the laws being violated, right? Well, they're all happy to do that when they think that the issue is really one of the railway employee having done the wrong thing, as they tried to do for conductor trainee Jason Cluney. Oh, he flipped a switch the wrong way, and that's what killed him. Oh, wait a minute, there's a lot more to that issue, including deadly training slide number 53. So, things are not always as they seem, folks, and the way that these reports are written, they're definitely slanted to the advantage of rail carriers, Transport Canada, and the Government of Canada, in my humble opinion. So when I read these, I read them with a grain of salt now, for good reason. So they say here that there's other things, other things like other areas required longer term development, such as Canadian Rail operating rule revisions to include transfer movements and remote control locomotive operations. Well, that's what this was all about. You've had from the time of this audit, okay, which they published in October, and then the second report comes out, but we're going to tell you anyways that it's going to take us a while to still update the Canadian Rail operating rules and come up with rules for remote control locomotive operations. Oh yeah, it took them a while because Transport Canada issued its first guideline for remote control locomotive operations in 2019. And remote control locomotive operations were never included to this day in the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation as an area for specific training in Appendix 14. It's only now, 38 years later, after that regulation was first written in 1987, it is only now that Transport Canada is finally moving to include remote locomotive operations, remote control locomotive operations, rail traffic control as part of training programs under the regulation. And again, track maintenance wants to be included. Transport Canada doesn't seem to want to include them, even though they should. And again, if rail workers get killed that are maintenance workers, they should, quite frankly, launch a class action against Transport Canada. Just my humble opinion. So to say that, oh, it's going to take us more time to do these other corrective actions, well, again, this is just a way to let them off the hook again. Oh, it's going to take more time. Yeah, years more time is what it would end up being. There's no excuse for this stuff, folks. Just no excuse. There's no follow-up. There's no compliance audits. There's no nothing on the part of Transport Canada. So as much as the rail carriers are to blame, in my opinion, Transport Canada holds just as much blame in all these issues as the rail carriers. And then it says, while the audits showed evidence of risk assessment undertaking consistent with CN safety management systems, that's the regulation, the documentation that's supposed to be in place per the law of 2001. Risk assessment protocol, data from ongoing data collection processes is not regularly used to trigger a formal risk assessment. So what are they using in assessing risks, if not what they're collecting, if they're even collecting it? Because a lot of it is swept under the carpet, and not even collected, as in delay of assignment issues. And we'll just let that all evaporate as an issue because we're not going to address this within the required 28 days that the union contract says we need to address this issue, or the statement disappears. So again, it's all in, knowing what they actually do versus what's written here. The process for tracking, analysis, and follow-up of corrective actions stemming from completed risk assessments was not implemented as outlined in CN's corrective action / safety measurement standards. Are we surprised? By now, is anyone surprised by any of this? All right, the last thing that I want to raise here before we move on is the second green arrow on this page 19, because I didn't go over this when I was going through the rest of this page previously. But if you look here, it says documentation did not include clear descriptions of overview roles and responsibilities for management levels above the frontline supervisor. Okay, so roles and responsibilities pertaining to safety are not outlined, and people don't know what their roles are above the frontline supervisors? I don't believe that. You've got a VP of safety, you've got a chief operations officer. What are their roles when it comes to safety? They're not in their job descriptions? If they're not, again, you think a jury might have a problem with that? Are you saying that only frontline supervisors are really responsible for safety management documentation? It says here, you know, when it says safety management documentation can be improved, and it doesn't go above the role of frontline people. Like I said, safety management systems documentation, virtually, in my opinion, is probably non-existent at CN Rail. Why would it not have been released when it was requested upon the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney? And why did Transport Canada not get a court order to force the release of that documentation? I don't think that the Act states that it's supposed to stop at the frontline level. This is supposed to be throughout the organization, I believe, which would mean all the way to the top. And so, again, when CN's officers are signing off that they are in compliance with all laws under which they operate, when it comes to safety management documentation and safety management systems, I have huge concerns with whether or not that would be true. I already know they don't operate within the Railway Safety Act, Section 20, and the Railway Employee Qualifications Standards Regulation, Section 5, and there's other laws I'm sure we could go over. But anyway, just saying, based on my dissection of a rail worker death investigation, there's been a lot of violations of laws, in my humble opinion, at CN Rail, with Transport Canada being a rail partner in crime, turning a blind eye to it all. Until now, it's hitting the fan because the U.S. is now involved, and the U.S. will not let this slide the way Canada has. Not when these videos are coming out and when I'm pushing information, not just to unions in the U.S., but to the Trump administration itself. So I think it could get a lot uglier, but that's just my humble opinion. All right, this is going to conclude part 5 of the Operational Excellence series on the UPNS Merger YouTube channel. And the reason I include that here is because some of this has to do with John Orr, as it pertains to issues with MacYard. He oversaw MacYard in the 2005-2006 timeframe. And again, this video is almost identical to part 4 of the 2007 MacYard Incident series on Rail Families United YouTube channel. So make sure that you look really at both YouTube channels, Rail Families United, as well as this one, UPNS Merger, if you really want to understand all the issues, because they're so intertwined, and YouTube won't allow me to put exactly the same video on both channels. And so that's what I had to change this one slightly And I decided to put it under the Operational Excellence series on the UPNS Merger channel, even though it's in another series on the Rail Families United channel, because that one has a lot more videos pertaining to Mackyard. But I would again encourage everybody, make sure you look at all videos on both YouTube channels because they are so interrelated.